Okay, so we learned how to take the derivative of cosine of x at the end of class last time, and I believe we got negative sine x. You can do a similar process just like we did with cosine, and I think this one's in the book if you want to see it, but you use those same sort of trig identities, and you'll get that the derivative of sine is going to be cosine of x. So these are your new derivative laws that you want to memorize for the trig section. So that takes care of 2 out of our 6 trig functions, and we're going to derive the derivative of at least one other, but you can do all of them. So remember, tangent of x, so if we want to take the derivative of tangent of x, we don't know that, but hopefully you remember that tangent looks something like sine of x over cosine of x. And so if we do that, now hopefully you remember there's a division here, so that's the quotient rule. So if we take the derivative of this using the quotient rule, we're going to get, remember, low d high, so I'm just going to put this with the derivative, minus high, and then times d low. And all of that is divided by the bottom squared. So now we're simplifying that, so we get cosine of x times cosine of x, because that's the derivative of sine from above. So we used this derivative for this. And then remember it's minus sine of x times the derivative of cosine of x, which is a negative sine of x. And all of that is divided by cosine squared of x. And now if we simplify, these two negatives turn into a plus. So we're going to get cosine squared x plus sine squared x all over cosine squared x, which hopefully you recognize is 1 over cosine squared of x, which is really secant squared of x. So we're able to derive the derivative of tangent just by knowing the derivative of sine and cosine. So you can imagine that you could also do this to get the other trig functions. So now on the next page we'll write down the derivatives of the remaining 3 trig functions, recognizing that you could find those derivatives using this same process. It's a great thing to practice, so if you all want, definitely try to do the derivative of cotangent, cosecant, and secant using this same idea of using the quotient rule and the derivatives of sine and cosine that we already know. So here's our list. So we have the derivative so far. We have the derivative of sine of x is cosine of x, and the derivative of tangent of x we got was secant squared. Also the derivative of cosine of x was a negative sine of x. If you do the derivative for cotangent, it ends up being negative cosecant squared x. And then if we take the derivative of secant x, we'll get secant x tangent x. And if we take the derivative of cosecant of x, we'll get negative cosecant x cotangent x. So this is cosecant, if that didn't show up very well. So those are our 6 derivatives. So these are your 6 derivatives that you'll want to memorize in order to be able to do all the trig derivatives that we're going to practice in class over the next few days. So definitely memorize these 6. One thing that's really helpful for me to memorize in terms of the negatives, if you notice there are 3 derivatives of trig functions that have negatives, and they all go with the c's. So it's any trig function that starts with c will have a negative derivative. That's one way to help me remember them. So cosine, cosecant, cotangent all have the negatives in front, and all the other ones are positive. So that's one way to remember it. So I don't know how you want to do that, but C is like, stands for con, and con is like negative. So if you want to remember that, you can help kind of keep track of which ones have positives and which ones have negatives. So that's all we need to do for the rest of this week. We'll practice a lot of examples of taking derivatives of trig functions in class, and then we should be set with derivatives of trig functions.